Welcome back everyone to the React In-Depth YouTube series. In this video, what we're going to go over is events in React together. Events are a really central part to understanding how we can kind of interact with the UI and with kind of other functions and other systems. And in order to actually really understand how they work, we're going to compare them to both the DOM as well as just regular old HTML, so we can see some of the differences and how React actually deals with these events. So that we can actually get really good at understanding how things go wrong if indeed we see bugs happen in our program. So without further ado, I'd like to go through a bunch of stuff I have prepared for us, including a bunch of code. So let's get right into the content. Okay, so to start, I just kind of want to go over and zoom out and think of what events are in general before we start diving deep in. So events in general, so regardless of React, are just a way for kind of our code or us writing the code to signal to other parts of our program that something has happened, right? So if you go back to kind of the my DOM API course, what you see in there is I kind of have a graphic where I shared like signal fires, for example. That is a perfect kind of analogy for what an event is. We're putting out a signal that something has happened, and maybe it's a blue fire, maybe it's a red fire, maybe it's a green fire, right? And depending on what color it is, we can kind of signal to someone else, somewhere else, that something has happened. So same thing with events in general, and React is no different. Now, events in React are very, very similar to the DOM API events. There's only just some small differences, and I'll kind of point out a couple of them as we go through them together. And again, in the context of React, these events allow us to react and make changes to the user interface or to the actual application that we're working on. For example, we can maybe like when you submit a form or when you type into an input, we can like validate it, or we can send a fetch request to the server. We can do all sorts of things, and these are usually done with events. Now, one thing to keep in mind is React uses this idea of a synthetic event. And this is just kind of a layer or a wrapper built on top of the regular event interface that comes with the DOM. The reason they do this is for cross-platform compatibility. So if you do see this kind of synthetic event thing, just kind of think of it just like you would a regular event in the browser. In fact, you can even get access to what's called the native event, and I'll show you that as we go through these slides together. But really, it's the same thing as just the regular event in the DOM API. So let's take a look at just some syntax so we can see some and compare and contrast some similarities and some differences so we can get a good idea of what's happening. So over here on the left, I have the DOM API version of making an event. So let's just go through that really quick together. We have a function here, and we have inside this function another function. If you haven't seen this before, I would encourage you to kind of look at the concept of closures, which I go through in my JavaScript series. Definitely kind of a tricky concept to wrap your mind around the first time, but we're going to be doing this quite a lot throughout React. And in fact, since React is functional, we kind of always do this pretty much in almost every single component for the most part. So we have a kind of an outer function, and in that function, we are defining another function called handle input. This is going to take something E, and it's going to just log it out. Okay. Now this function, if you just look at it, just this plain function by itself, it literally does pretty much nothing. It's just a wrapper around console log. That's all it really is. Okay. We could use this without events and it would work just fine. I could call this and log out a string, for example, and it would work just fine. Okay. Now, what I've done over here, again, this is the DOM API. I've created an input element and then an input node specifically in the DOM. And then I've attached right here, most critically, the onInput property. And notice that it's in lowercase, which is pointing to this function up here. Now, we're going to look at some syntax later as to how you can do this incorrectly and correctly, and kind of what the real nuances is when you're actually doing it this way. But keep in mind that I'm not calling the handle input function here. I am just passing a handle, no pun intended, to the handle input function. And the job of the event handler is to, when this event gets triggered, to call this handle input function and pass it our event. Okay, so we go over this in the DOM API videos as well, if you want to kind of get a good understanding of just how events work, as well as things like bubbling and delegation. So in this case, we're returning that DOM node, and we can use it anywhere within our app in the context of just a regular DOM, which is pretty great. So when we click or sorry, in this case, when we actually type inside of this input, this is going to trigger and we're going to see a log being logged out. Now let's contrast this to how you would do the exact same thing, but in React, which I have here on the right-hand side. So even the outer function name, I've named the same thing. You'll notice even the inner function name, handle input, I've named the same thing, right? So from here to here, literally the same thing. The only real difference is that we're using JSX instead of the regular DOM APIs to create the nodes. And React is going to be using this to do a react.createElement, and it's going to pass it all of the what are called props, or the properties and attributes that it needs to actually do the same thing that we're doing over here manually. So over here, I'm returning JSX, and I'm giving it the onInput attribute, and I'm passing it in curly brackets, since this is JavaScript, a handle to the handle input function. Now, this one line is kind of confusing. So I'm just going to go through this a bit slowly, just so it makes sense. I'm going to try to use the right language so we can kind of communicate technically kind of the intent of what this is actually doing as best as I can. So we're returning something. What are we returning? We're returning a React element, because this is going to call react.createElement right here. And this is going to be an input node. And we are passing the onInput attribute to this input node. So that is a special attribute that is one of the event triggers. And it actually maps directly to this one, for example, in the DOM. And React knows that since this is an event handler or an event listener, we're going to actually need to pass it a function to call as a callback to do something when that event happens. So which is the event in this case? Well, it's the input event. There are other types of events, like for example, on focus or on blur or on scroll, and we can do different things depending on what we want the intended functionality of the elements to do. In this case, we're saying on input. Sometimes you'll see people use on change, and in React, they're the exact same thing. There's some small difference in how that works in the DOM. Every time some text gets changed inside of this input box, I'm telling React, please go and call the handle input function and pass it implicitly the event object as the first parameter, the first argument. So handle input's going to get called every single time this triggers, which is every time the key changes. And then we're going to call this function. We're going to pass to this E here, the actual event itself, in this case, the synthetic React input event, and we're going to log it out because that's what our function does. Okay, now that is a lot, and it definitely takes a bit of getting used to. And we'll go over some common mistakes and why those are mistakes, and how you can kind of wrap your mind around to kind of avoid those mistakes once you actually see the intended functionality. So let's just quickly look really quick at the syntax for how you do this in just regular plain old HTML without the like explicit kind of DOM API methods, so we're not going through JavaScript to create this element. And I'm going to show you a demo. So on the left again here, I have the HTML example. And what I have here is a body tag. So you can see I've just kind of cropped out the head and the HTML tags and stuff like that, just so we can focus on the body. But that's all that's in here in this case. And I have a script. And in that script, I'm defining a function called handle input. It takes one argument and it's going to log it out. And then I'm creating an input tag again. This is not JSX. This is just regular old HTML. Okay, I say old. I shouldn't say old. Just regular HTML. And you can notice that we're passing the on input. Notice the lowercase here, because this again is HTML. And notice that there's no curly brackets because this is not JSX. I'm saying it 100 times. This is regular HTML. We're passing it a string, and that string, we actually have to call the function as opposed to passing a handle to the function, because that's how the HTML attribute for the kind of like the on something properties actually work. So what are we saying? Well, we're saying call handle input and pass it the event. Now this is a bit janky. I'm not really a fan of this syntax because in this case, event is kind of a global magical object that exists in the global namespace. And it has to be called event in this case, otherwise nothing can get attached to it. And then that's what gets passed to E, which is the actual event at that moment in time. And then we can log it out. Okay, so I yeah, it's a bit confusing. There's a lot of kind of weird quirks with how that works, but that's effectively how this works. The main difference being, look that this is not camel case. This is all lowercase. This is a string, and we're calling the function directly. We're not passing a handle to the function or a callback in here. We're calling handle input in these inside these string quotes, right? With actual parentheses. Now contrast that again to the exact same example I just showed you earlier on the right hand side. The way that we do this in React is like this. Notice that we the on input is camel case, and we're not calling handle input. We're passing a handle to handle input. Okay, so I'm going to pull out VS Code. We're going to look at demo this, and we're going to see kind of some things that go wrong, and compare and contrast what a callback really is and why these why it works kind of in this exact way. So I'm going to pull up VS Code here. I have a folder open. I encourage you to open up a blank folder, and you can actually run kind of this command here. So we have npm create. We've seen this before. And we're going to use vite at latest to start a new React project. I'll just follow the prompts here. So it's going to say, what does my project name going to be? It's going to say like events demo. And I'm going to use React here, and I'm going to use just regular JavaScript. I'll clear that out. I'll cd to, oops, not de, cd to events demo, and I'll npm install in there. Now, while that's doing that, I'm going to open this up. I'll open up my source folder, and then I have my main.jsx and then my app.jsx as well. So inside of app, what I'm going to do is pretty much just get rid of everything up here. I don't want any of that stuff at the very, very top of app. I'm also actually going to get rid of everything inside of app. So it pretty much just looks like this, right? And I'm going to return in here for now. I'm just going to return a p tag, and I'm just going to say hello React for now. Okay, maybe I'll capitalize this. All right. So once that's npm installed, what I can do is I can run npm run dev, and that's going to start the dev server and actually serve up this this entire project to a local URL. And if I command or control click on that, that should open up in my browser there, and I can get rid of some formatting in the main file. But if I have this open and I open my console, what we'll see is, let me just zoom in on this as well, that we have our div root, and then we have our p tag in there, which is being displayed here on the left. Again, this styling is coming from the main.jsx. So to get rid of that styling, I can just come in here and kind of get rid of this index.css there in the main file, and that'll just get rid of all the remainder of the CSS that's being applied, and we'll see kind of the regular vanilla styling. Okay, now I'm going to come back in here and go to app.jsx. And let's say that I want to attach an event listener to this p tag. Okay, so what would I do? Well, in the DOM API, we could do this in different ways. And in HTML, we would say, for example, let's say when I click it, I want something to happen when I click this p tag, right? I would say on click like this, okay? And then I would pass it a function, and I will call that function. So let me say that I just want to log something out. So I'm going to create a function in here, and I'm just going to say handle click. Now you'll probably notice, I'll just hide this sidebar for a second. You'll probably notice me saying always like handle something, handle something. Now this is generally the kind of recommended way to do this. I sometimes use it. I'm just going to use it for purposes of this demo. I like to be a bit more explicit with what actually the purpose and the semantics of this actual click is. So for example, if it was like a form submission, I would say like form submit or something, or handle submit, some people call it. So it's really up to you. There's some more specific things that can happen if it's more customized. At the very least, I would suggest you use this kind of nomenclature, and then you can kind of evolve it with your own project as you get more experience. So in here, we're going to take one single argument, e, and we can use that as our parameter inside this function. And we can, for example, in this case, we can log it out. I'll log out e. Okay. Now, how do we do this if this was regular HTML? Well, if this was regular HTML, we wouldn't use curly brackets because those don't exist. And we would use, actually double quotes here, double quotes, and we would say handle click, and we would pass it event, just like that, right? Now, this looks kind of weird, and it should to you in the context of React. Notice that this is basically just a string, right? So if I save this file, let's see what happens. I'm going to come back to my Chrome, and I'm going to switch to my console. And you can even see that I'm getting a warning from React being like, are you sure that's what you meant? Did you really mean on click with the camel case there? And when I click on this, right, you see I'm clicking here, right, and nothing is happening, right? Nothing is happening at all. In fact, when I go to the Elements tab and I look at the p tag and I look at the event listeners on it, actually, there's a whole bunch of event listeners in this case. So this is probably not a good example in this case. That's coming from, I think, the extension and just React in general actually hijacked some things so that I can forward them. But I'll go back to the console here so we can see that nothing is actually happening in this case with this p tag. So what do we have to do to make this work? Well, we have to first change this, as the warning suggested, to a capital C. So this is camel case on, and then the camel case for the next thing. So it's supposed to be on click, on input, on change, on blur, etc., etc. And most of the actual events are supported in React as you would expect, just like they are in HTML and then the DOM API. The other difference is we need to change this from being quotes, so string, to these curly brackets. So what do curly brackets mean? We saw that in the previous video for JSX, that this means, hey, evaluate some actual real JavaScript here instead of like JSX tags or strings or anything like that. So this is actual JavaScript here in this case. And what does that mean? Well, that's saying go look for a variable called handle click and pass it this event thing. Okay, so if I save this and I come back to Chrome, and I click on this, notice that nothing is really still happening, right? I'm definitely clicking on this paragraph, right? And nothing is really happening. Okay, so that's interesting. But do notice as well that we actually get undefined. So I'm going to reload this page. I want to show you something. I'm going to reload the page. And it looks like we have something, this message event, not really sure what that is. But technically what we should be getting is undefined. So if I just want to test something. If I get rid of event there and I reload this page, I get undefined. Okay, so I think I actually don't really know what happens here when I pass in event. Let me just take a look here, reload the page one more time. That's interesting. I actually, I'm not sure why that changes based on the thing that we're passing in. I'll need to look it up. So let's just get rid of event there. You see there's always new things that you can learn when you're going through this stuff. But I'm going to get rid of the event object that gets passed in, and that's the global object event, which generally you should never really use because there's a lot of issues that come with using global variables. I'm just going to call handle click just like this. And come in here, I'm going to reload the page, and you'll see that I get undefined. As soon as the page loads, right, I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to get undefined right away. I haven't even clicked anything yet. All I clicked was the refresh button, right? I haven't clicked inside the actual DOM itself anywhere, and I'm getting undefined logged out. And that's coming from JSX line 3, which is right here. So it's actually calling this function console log e. So that is interesting. I guess now I'm actually seeing where the event is coming from. It's actually, it's by default a message event that's being logged out, which is the global event by default until you override it with another event. So there you go. You learn something new all the time, even as I'm recording these videos. So we didn't do anything and we're getting this logged out, but then when I click on this, nothing is happening. So that's bizarre, right? I want you to think about that for a second. And we're going to revisit this as a kind of a wrong setup and a wrong syntax in a second. So this is incorrect. The way that we want to do this is actually by just passing a handle to that function, and React is then going to call that function when the actual event happens. So I'm going to save this. And I'm going to switch back. I'm going to refresh this page. Notice we don't get any logs this time. The only difference we have is that we're not calling the function right away. We're just passing the handle to the function. And now when I click on this, you'll see that we get a synthetic event, which is the React event that I talked about, which is actually a click event in this case. And if I open this up, you'll see that there's all the things associated with a click event, like the X and Y coordinates of that, and the actual target in this case, the p tag, etc., etc. So that's pretty cool. So that actually works correctly, right? So let's review this really quick. We have a p tag And in React, we're using camel case for the on and then the name of the event. And then we're passing in a handle in curly brackets, which is evaluating to JavaScript of the actual function that we want to call. And React is going to pass as the event object implicitly and fill in this argument E that we have in this case. We call this whatever we want with that event object automatically for us. Okay. Now, before we kind of go into why this is, I want to kind of take a step back and explain what a callback function is in general, and then we can revisit this in hopefully a new light and it'll make some sense. So I'm actually going to create a new file inside of src. I'll just call this, let's call it callbacks.js. And I'm just going to make this a JS file, just so I can show you that this has nothing to do with React at all. Okay, so you've probably seen the map method. So what do I mean by that? Let's make a const. Let's just say, let's say, I don't know, heroes is equal to an array. And in here, I'm going to put Iron Man, and I'll put Superman, I'll put Wonder Woman, and I'll put, there we go, Natter. That's not egotistical at all. I'm a hero as well, I guess. Why not? Put yourself in there if you're doing this yourself. So we know that arrays have a bunch of methods on them, right? So we can do things like map, we can do things like filter and reduce. So let's take a look what that means. So I'm going to say heroes.map, and we know that map kind of loops through the array that we're interested in this case, hero. So it's going to loop through each of these strings one at a time, right? And we're going to get access to each of those values as our argument to the map function. So in here, what we're going to do is normally how this works is I would say we will get access to each hero, and then we can do something with that hero. For example, in this case, I'm going to maybe return hero plus and then exclamation mark. Okay. Now map returns a new array. So I'm going to call this const, let's say exclaimed heroes. That's a very long word. I don't know why I decided to go with that, but let's just go with that. And then we can do console.log the exclaimed heroes. All right. Now, what is happening here, right? We've seen map before, and I know you're probably like, oh my gosh, Natter, this is an event video. What are you doing? Like, can we please go back to React? But I really implore you just to stick with this just for a couple of minutes, because it's so central to understanding how events work, is understanding how callbacks work. So if I open up my terminal here, I'm just going to open up another terminal, and I'll just do a new terminal. I think there's a button somewhere. I should forget where it is. But what I'll do here is I'll run node, and then I'm going to run a src. Well, actually, I'll run ls really quick. I'll cd events demo. I got to make sure I'm in the correct folder. I'll run ls. There we go. I'll cd to source. Now I'm in here, and now I can run node callbacks.js. So make sure you're in the correct folder. You can cd to the correct folder, and you can actually see that you have the files that you're interested in, or you can just use node and then the full folder file structure. But what we'll see here is that I'm actually getting every single one of these elements in this array with an exclamation now logged out, right? Because that's what we're doing here. Now, I want you to think for a second. This, probably you're looking at this and like, okay, this is really easy. I kind of get it. I've seen map before. Now, what happens if I had this? Let's say now I have a function, and I'm going to call this exclaim. Okay, and this is going to take some string. And what it's going to do is just going to return the string, but plus the exclamation mark. Okay, now what can we do here with our code to make it use this function instead of kind of what we have hard coded here? Well, all we have to do here is we're going to change the return statement to return of exclaim, and I'm going to pass in the hero, right? So I'll save that. I'll open up my file again here, clear the terminal, run that one more time, and lo and behold, it works just as we expect, perfectly fine. So hopefully you're slowly following along, right? All I did was instead of hard coding the logic in here, I'm referring to this function over here. Now, can we shorten this? Is there a way to actually shorten this? Well, you're probably thinking, well, yeah, I can use a kind of nice ES6, like one-liner kind of thing. So let's do that. Let's get rid of this one here and get rid of this semicolon here and get rid of that one there and get rid of the return. And now if I save this file, what we'll see is that this is the exact same thing, but we're using the implicit return from this function since we're returning the string plus an exclamation. So is this going to work? Let's take a look. I'm going to switch back. I'm going to come here. I'm going to run this one more time, and it absolutely does work. So that's great, right? That hopefully you can look at this code. You're like, okay, that makes sense. I'm kind of getting you, right? Now, is there a way to shorten this even further? I want you to think about that for a second. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to I'll comment this line out and I'll copy it here and comment it back in just so you can see as a reference what we're kind of trying to do, but we'll do slightly differently. I'm actually going to get rid of this entirely and this entirely. And I'm just going to say heroes.map exclaim. Okay. And I'm going to save this. I want you to think, is this going to work? Yes or no? All right. So I'm going to pull this up. And I'm going to run this, and it does work. Okay, so what is happening here? Well, what's happening is we're passing a handle or a callback function where the map function, the map method on the array knows that I need to call the function that I'm being given. So in this case, it's going to call exclaim, and it's going to pass to that function that we give it as the first argument the actual value that it's mapping over one at a time. So the first time it calls exclaim, it's going to be Iron Man, then Superman, then Wonder Woman, then Natter. Right? Now, what's the difference between that one and this one? Well, here all we're doing is putting it in line. We basically have the same thing as here. It's just that there's no name because it's an anonymous function, and we just named the actual parameter slightly differently. This could be str, for example. Right? So if I rename this to str, hopefully you can see that basically these are the same thing. It's just I did it in line here, and over here I have it explicitly defined. Okay, now this works because the first argument passed implicitly from map to the function is always going to be the item itself. All right, so now I want you to think for a second. I'm going to comment this one out as well. I'm going to copy it. I want you to think what's going to happen if instead of calling exclaim like this, we just do this. Okay. Now I'm going to save this, and I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to run this, and now I get a crazy looking error, right? Where I see undefined is not a function inside of our array map. So what does that mean? Well, what's happening here is instead of actually passing a handle to or a callback into map, we're passing in the result of calling this exclaim function. So what's happening is we're calling exclaim and we're passing undefined. So we're not passing in str, so it's undefined. And we're doing undefined plus a exclamation, which doesn't work, and it's going to break. Okay. Imagine if I was to pass in exclaim and I do a, let's just say a smiley face in there. And I redo this over here. We're going to get the same thing over here. Smiley face exclamation is not a function at array map. Okay, so the reason is that the result of this function is going to be the string. So we're getting back, the first time we were just getting back exclamation, I think, or was it undefined? I think it was I think we were getting back undefined plus exclamation because it was actually doing some weird JavaScript stuff there. And the second time we were getting back this. And what map is trying to do is it's trying to call this with each value at a time. So it's trying to do this basically, right here. It's trying to do this. And you're probably looking at this and being like, what are you doing there? Like, this is just a bunch of gibberish. And it is gibberish. That's why it's complaining, because this makes no sense. We're trying to call this with Iron Man, and we can't call it because this is not a function. This is just undefined and exclamation point. And this is just a string. This is a string. We can't call a string with another string like this. We can't call this string with another string like that. Right? So we're taking the result of this, which is going to be a string, and we're trying to call it with each value one at a time. The same concept applies to events. Okay, this is where I'm going to loop it back. So sorry for the tangent. Hopefully that clears it up a little bit, because this is one of the most central parts of confusion. Hopefully you can see now why I am not putting in parentheses here, because I am passing onClick expects a callback or a function to call, and it's going to give us the event just like our map gave us each element one at a time. So we want to pass it a handle to the callback or to the function. We don't want to pass it the result of already calling that function. In fact, when we call that function here, what happens, let me show you really quick. What is this, right? Just like that. And I come back to Chrome and I reload this page. What we'll see is, what is this logged out right away? And the reason for that is that React is going to run app from top to bottom. It's going to create this function. It's going to create this JSX element, but we're telling it to execute this function and take the return value and then call that on onClick. And in the process of executing this function, it's going to log out, what is this? Because that's what we're telling it to do. And it's going to take undefined, which is the value of onClick in this case, and it's going to put that in the onClick handler, which is not what we want. We want to pass it handle click as a function to call, and this is not going to call the function. So the JSX, when it gets parsed, is not going to call handle click. It's just going to be passed as a variable to call in the future, or call back. That's where the name callback comes from, right? So hopefully you can see the parallels between what we just did here as an exercise with the map function and just callbacks in general, and how we actually deal with it in the actual event handlers in React. So very, very common thing. I want to spend more time on that explicitly, because it is to really understand what's happening there kind of takes a lot of mental leaps, including knowing that this entire function runs the very first time it needs to get rendered, and this is going to actually get evaluated, and then the result of that evaluation is going to be what the onClick actually calls, or the on whatever actually calls. Okay, so hopefully I've beat that enough for you. Now, I'd like to switch back here to the slides, and I want to show off this kind of wrong syntax. So over here, we can see on the left-hand side of the DOM API, I just forgot to label this. This is the React side on the right. And what we could do here is call that function and put it into the on input, right? But we just saw that this returns undefined. So we're actually saying input on input is equal to undefined. If you think about it, if you trace this code, handle input being called with an event is going to log out that event, and it's going to return undefined, which is what gets put in here, which is not what we want. So the on input is basically going to do nothing, right? And the same thing is true over here, which we just saw together right now. If I call handle input and I pass it, we're executing this function, getting the result of that function, and then putting that as the callback to the on input. So this is not what we want. There are two ways to actually do what we want in React, also in the DOM API. And in the DOM API, we already saw an example of this. We pass the handle over here, and in React, we pass the handle over here as well. Now, I do want to mention another way to do this. And if you think back to the map example that we just looked at, this should make kind of sense. So one more way that you can do this is like this. We can actually pass it a function that just calls our function that we wanted to call in the first place. Now, this seems kind of weird. We're kind of going the runaround. It's like, why not just pass the function directly? Now, let's just look through this really quick, and I'll give you an example of when you would actually need to do it this way. In fact, this is probably the way that you're seeing it most of the time if you worked on React projects. So in the DOM API, it would look like this. The only real change here is this line right here, the on input. Instead of passing handle input like we did over here directly, what we're doing is passing in a callback that takes the event and then just forwards it to handle input and passes the same event in that way. Now, you can see that this is a function that we're assigning to on input. We're not calling the function here. We're just defining an anonymous function that calls our function. So when this function gets called, this is going to be E, and then it's going to actually call our handle input inside of there. Now, Over here in React land, we can do the exact same thing, right? We can say on input, I just put this on a separate line just so I didn't run out of space for you. You can see that we're evaluating the exact same thing. We're evaluating an anonymous function that takes the input and just forwards it to our function that we wanted to actually use. So why would you ever do this? Let me actually just code it really quick just so you can see exactly how this works in practice, and then we'll see when this is useful. So the only change we need to make over here is we have to, instead of calling handle click like this, we want to be able to do this. We want to be able to call handle click and pass it the event. Well, we don't have this event. You can call it whatever you like, really. It doesn't matter in this case. So we're going to get that from this callback right here. So if I think if I say this, it'll actually wrap it in more brackets so it's a bit more clear. We're going to pass it an anonymous function that takes a single argument and then forwards that over to handle click and passes in the exact argument that it was passed, which is going to be the event, which we already know because that's what happened over here. All right, so just to prove to you that this actually works, if I come back here and I reload the page and I click on Hello React, you'll see that we get that base event and everything that we need from that event is in there. Now, while we're here, really quick, before I switch back, I do want to mention that the actual native event here is the actual regular browser event, which you can see is the pointer event, which comes from the event interface of the DOM. All this other stuff, most of the time, does match what you'd see in there, but there are some React-specific things as well in there, which is why it's a synthetic base event from React and not just a regular pointer event. So you can kind of get the target, you can get the value, you can get all that kind of stuff depending on what type of event it is. But do notice that it is slightly different from the regular event. If you do need the actual DOM event for whatever reason, I don't really know. I haven't had many cases where I've had to do this, but it is in the actual native event if you do need it. And there are things like stop propagation and prevent default as well. If you're confused about what those are, I have a video on event propagation, bubbling, and capturing and all that kind of stuff in the DOM video. And it's the exact same thing in React. There is no fundamental difference between how that actually works. Okay, so back to this. Why would you ever do it this way? Well, if you only have one argument, right, you wouldn't really need to do it this way. This is just more verbose, right? If you think about this example right here from our callback demo, right, where I just pass in exclaim, if that's the only thing I needed to do and I don't have to pass in any extra information, then this makes sense, right? This is perfect. I don't need to do anything else here. This is probably the cleanest and most concise way that you could define that. But imagine for a second, I wanted to pass more information to this function when I call it, so at the time of it being called. What we could do is we could pass that in right here. So like, for example, let's say handle click, it took the event, but we also wanted to take a like some kind of string. Okay, and maybe we log the event, and then we do a console.log of the string. Okay. Now, right now, what's going to happen if I don't pass in that string? The event still gets passed in. And if I reload this page, what we'll see is I get the event, but then I get undefined for the string, right? Because if we don't pass in a argument, that just gets filled in as undefined. We can give it a default value here and everything, but what if I actually want to give it a valid value that's unique to this paragraph? Well, what I could do is using this here, I could come in at E and I could say, I want to pass in like some ID, right? Some unique P, for example, right? This is like a unique P tag. And if I do that, now what I'm saying is take the event that comes from React and the DOM, pass it straight through to handle click because that's the first argument, and then also pass it the string unique P. And the event's going to get passed through right here in E, and then unique P is going to get passed in right here as a string. And if I reload this page, instead of seeing undefined, we'll actually get our unique P logged out. And we can pass any unlimited number of extra arguments to our functions using this type of syntax. So basically, long story short, if you have multiple arguments that you need to pass in, this is definitely the way to do it. But if you only have to call it with one argument, then you can kind of go what we had earlier, very similar to map, filter, reduce, and all those kinds of callback functions. We can just pass it in directly here. And there's the implicit passing of the actual event object. So that was quite a lot. I hope that you found this video valuable. If you did, I would love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. What we're going to do in the next video is get more practice with these events in React together by doing a bunch of exercises. And we're going to go through a bunch of them so that we can get more examples with just regular components, JSX, and now this added complexity of adding these events with callbacks. This is going to set us up really, really nicely for when we actually look at things like state later, because once you understand how events are totally separate from that concept, it's much easier to put those two things together and actually work off of them to build really complicated applications. So I hope you loved this video. I'll see you in the next one. See you later.